Today, I'm going to tell two stories that prove, no matter what we think science can tell us about the natural world, the wilderness still holds secrets we cannot understand. Today's episode is a very special extra episode. It's part of a new series I'm calling You Can't. If you're a fan of my YouTube channel, you know that I tell stories about places you can't go and people who went anyways. People have really enjoyed those stories, and so we decided to tell some more of them here on the podcast under the title You Can't. We have a You Can't episode. We release those as they come up. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer to make the follow button a delicious tuna fish sandwich, but then use a can of cat food instead. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the evening of January 3rd, 1991, a 40-year-old mountain climber named Yi Song felt the wind and snow whipping against his face as he stared up at a mountain peak jutting through the clouds high above him. Yi was standing more than two-thirds of the way up a mountain called Kawa, which is the highest mountain in the Ballen snow mountain range in southwest China. Kawa stands at an elevation of about 22,000 feet, which is more than 4 miles. And nobody in recorded history had ever reached its peak. In fact, the Tibetan villagers who lived at the base of this mountain believed that nobody ever would. And some of those villagers regularly tried to prevent would-be climbers from even trying. But Yi and the 17-member team of climbers he was helping to lead were determined to prove the villagers wrong, and to make history. They had started climbing this mountain a month earlier, and they were now closer to the peak of Kawa than anyone had ever gotten. Yi turned his gaze away from the peak and looked around the temporary camp where he and his team were planning to spend the night. He could see several climbers struggling to reinforce their tents against the snow and the wind. He and his team had chosen to climb at this time of year because it was known as the dry season, when major storms were actually rare. So Yi couldn't understand why the snow just kept coming down. He grabbed his radio off his belt and called down to base camp, which was a camp at the foot of the mountain where other members of the team provided weather information and support to the climbers. Yi told a base camp team member that the snow was still unbelievably falling hard up here. That team member reminded him that the climbers should clear snow away from their tents at least every 2 hours. Yi was about to respond, but just then, his radio cut out, and he heard this loud buzzing sound coming from it. He stared down at his radio, confused. This was the sound it made when it needed a new battery, but he had just put a new battery in. Yi fumbled with the radio, trying to fix it, but all he could hear was this buzzing sound, and then also, periodically, he'd hear the voice of the base camp team member cutting in and out. Yi communicated over the radio and wasn't sure if anyone heard it, but he said he was losing communication and he would try to contact them again later. Then Yi turned off his radio, clipped it to his belt, and the buzzing stopped. As the sun finished setting, the wind picked up even more. Yi craned his neck upwards again, and he saw that the peak of Kawa had now disappeared in the snow and the darkness. Yi had done lots of difficult climbs in the past, and he was sort of used to running into problems right when he thought he was about to achieve his goals. That was just how mountains worked. All the planning in the world could not prepare climbers for everything. But for some reason, this felt different. This storm just didn't show any signs that it would ever let up. Yi lowered his head and walked towards a group of tents. He wanted to help his team clear snow away. But all of a sudden, Yi heard screaming coming from inside one of these tents. He and several other climbers moved as quickly as they could through the snow toward the sound. They stepped into the tent, and they saw a woman laying in her sleeping bag, and she was shivering uncontrollably, and sweat was running down her forehead. Yi knew this woman, who was one of several Japanese climbers on their team, had been dealing with a high fever for days. But now, she didn't just look sick. She looked terrified. As soon as Yi entered the tent, the woman stopped screaming, and she just started muttering. Yi knew some Japanese, but he couldn't make out what she was saying. He looked around the tent, and he could tell that the other Japanese climbers who had come in were also confused by the woman's words. Juryi turned to one of them and asked, what is she saying? And in a little more than a whisper, the climber told Juryi the woman was saying, "Something is coming." Later that night, the storm began to reach blizzard conditions as Juryi made his way around the camp, checking on his team. As bad as the weather had gotten, and as alarming as the screaming Japanese woman had been, Juryi refused to panic. He believed if everyone just stayed calm and prepared, they could make it through the night. But he quickly realized he was the only one who felt this way. Each climber Juryi spoke to seemed as frightened as the woman with the fever. He tried his best to calm everyone down he spoke to, but nothing he did seemed to work. So eventually, he headed back towards his own tent to make sure it was secure. But before he got there, he heard more shouting. At first, Juryi assumed it was the woman with the fever, but he listened more closely and he could tell it couldn't be, because it was a man's voice. Juryi trudged back through the snow towards this shouting man's tent to see what was wrong, and when he stepped inside, Juryi felt truly scared for the first time since he'd come to the mountain. Inside the tent, Juryi saw one of the climbers sitting by a fire, pen and notebook clutched in his hands, and on his face was this wild look. His eyes were darting from one side of the tent to the other, and he would shout at something only he could see and hear. And then he would scribble furiously in his notebook. It was like he had lost his mind. Juryi was so unsettled that he just backed out of the tent, and as soon as he was outside, he turned and began rushing back through the snow towards his tent. However, as he was between tents, he heard this loud rumbling sound, almost like the banging of a drum, coming from high up the mountain. He froze where he was, terrified, and he heard the sound of trees cracking and splitting, and he knew this must be it. This is the avalanche. However, when Juryi looked up the mountain, expecting to see a mass of ice and rock barreling down the mountain towards them, all he could see was the falling snow and the black night sky. There was no avalanche. Early the next morning, January 4th, the snowstorm subsided, and the weather on Kawagabawa turned calm and sunny. A team leader down at base camp radioed up to Juryi to see how the climbers fared over the night, but Juryi didn't respond. So the team leader tried radioing the other members of the team that were up there with Juryi as well, but they too didn't respond. And so this team leader sent out a small search team to see if they could get a visual of Juryi and the other climbers he was with. However, remember, these climbers were thousands of feet up the mountain from base camp. So under the best of circumstances, it would have been really hard to look up and have seen them. And these were certainly not the best circumstances. There had been this huge snowstorm over the night, a snowstorm that really wasn't even supposed to happen this time of the year, which made getting a visual on Juryi and his team nearly impossible. And so this team leader quickly realized that if the climbers had gotten lost up on the mountain, he didn't have the resources to mount an effective search. So he quickly informed multiple government agencies that his team was missing, and then the government took over. That day, the Chinese government launched a massive operation on Kawagabawa. Professional search and rescue teams worked with volunteers on the ground, and airplane and helicopter pilots circled the mountain. But after 2 weeks of this daily intense searching, it became clear Juryi and the rest of the climbers, along with any remnants of their camp, had disappeared. On January 22nd, so 18 days after the climbers had gone missing, rescuers abandoned the search, and the government issued an official statement. The statement said that while massive snowstorms were indeed rare for this time of the year, they were not actually impossible to occur. So officials said the storm likely caused an avalanche that wiped out the camp and buried the climbers somewhere they couldn't be found. Now, this explanation was very logical, and for most people, it marked the end of this very tragic story. But not for the villagers who lived at the base of Kawagabawa. These villagers, who didn't think anyone would ever summit the mountain, and who actively tried to stop those that did, they did not believe the official statement. They had a story of their own, which they were certain was the real explanation for what had happened to the climbers. And when the government issued its statement, these villagers tried to tell people that the government was wrong. And so, when climbers and tourists from all over came to Kawagabawa, these villagers told them what they believed actually happened, and how it would happen all over again if anyone tried to reach the mountain's peak. Now, most people dismissed the villagers' story as rumor or superstition, and that was a reasonable way to react to this, until 7 years later, when 3 shepherds from the village made a terrible discovery. 7 years later, on the afternoon of June 18, 1998, 3 shepherds were walking along a glacier near the base of Kawagabawa. This glacier was 2.5 miles away from where Juryi and the rest of his climbers had set up their final camp. But the shepherds were not there to do any kind of search. This glacier was located near their village, and it was home to a temple that they often visited. So they were talking and walking towards the temple when, just up ahead of them, one of the shepherds spotted something bright and colorful sticking up out of the ice. The group was intrigued, and they began walking towards it, thinking it might be a prayer flag. But as they got closer, and this colorful object came into focus, the group went quiet. And then the shepherds also saw there were other colored objects just like this one scattered around the area. These objects were the bodies of the climbers who had disappeared from Kawagabawa 7 years earlier, still wrapped in the colorful coats they'd been wearing when they headed up the mountain. But what the shepherds could not have known in this moment was that buried under the ice with the bodies was a diary, which one of the climbers had used to record the events of the ascent. It belonged to the climber that Juryi had seen shouting at an unseen force and scribbling furiously on the night they all vanished. And this diary would reveal that the stories the villagers told about Kawagabawa and the lost climbers were more than just legend. It turned out there was a very specific reason why these Tibetan villagers believed nobody would ever reach the peak of Kawagabawa. It was because the peak was said to be a sacred place. It was the home of a warrior protector god, and because of this, it was not meant for human beings to climb. The villagers believed that if anyone ever approached the peak, it would wake the spirits of the mountain, and the mountain god would punish them. This punishment would lead to death, but it would not stop there, because the dead would become prisoners of the mountain for 7 years. And these villagers had made their beliefs very clear to Juryi and the rest of his team of climbers who wanted to be the first people to ever reach Kawagabawa's peak. In fact, a group of villagers had heavily protested their climb and warned the climbers that their expedition would anger the mountain god and result in tragedy. But Juryi and the rest of his climbers had not heeded their warnings. The diary of the climber that was discovered along with the bodies recounted what happened as a result. The diary started like a lot of climbing diaries do, an account of the day's hike, the scenery, the weather. But as the dates got closer to the night the climbers disappeared, the diary took a strange turn. The writer became obsessed with these shadows he saw walking across his tent, and he said he heard women laughing and babies crying all around him in the darkness. That woman who had screamed out, who was sick with a fever, had said she felt something bad was coming, and she had tried to warn the others. But by the time Juryi heard the sound like beating drums high up on the mountain that he thought was an avalanche, like many thought was an avalanche, the mountain god had apparently already unleashed his wrath. As soon as Juryi and those climbers had disappeared, the villagers all assumed that they had faced the wrath of the mountain god. But the fact that their bodies had remained hidden for 7 years, the length of time the mountain god keeps the dead imprisoned in the mountain, was all the proof the villagers needed to know they were right. And the climber who wrote the diary ended up believing them too, although it was too late. In his final diary entry, he wrote, quote, "We were wrong. They are coming. Run." In 2001, 10 years after the climbers had died on the mountain, the Chinese government banned all mountain climbing activities in the Ballen snow mountain range. To this day, still, nobody on record has ever actually set foot on the peak of Kawagabawa. Our next story is called Something in the Bushes. On a June day in 1953, a 31-year-old American doctor named George Moore stood in a small mountain campsite in Nepal, staring out at a massive rainstorm forming on the horizon. George had been in Nepal, which is a country south of China, for 8 months, leading a small medical team trying to stop the spread of diseases like malaria in villages all across the region. This was groundbreaking work in 1953, and it was starting to make George famous back home in America. And here in Nepal, he had already become a trusted figure among the villagers many of whom had never seen a person from the west until they met George. But right now, a group of these villagers were scrambling to get George out of their village. And this was because of the storm that George was looking at. One of the villagers pointed at the clouds and told George this was not a regular thunderstorm. The monsoons were coming. And once the monsoons hit, the only dirt road that led back to George's base in the city of Kathmandu would flood very quickly. And the horrendous rains could last for months, which meant if George wanted to continue his work stopping disease in other parts of this region, he would have to get out right now. George had known the monsoon season was coming, but it had arrived much more quickly than he'd expected, and so he and his team were sort of caught off guard. The journey out of the village was not something they wanted to undertake suddenly with so little preparation, because they didn't have a car. They literally had to walk out, and so they needed to be fully prepared. And also, this dirt road out of the village went through a deep forest where the locals claimed it was inhabited by terrible monsters. Now, while George did not believe in the supernatural, he did think that, fantastical stories about monsters often started because of real-life animal attacks. And so, monsters or not, the forest was definitely dangerous, especially since they again would be on foot. But George knew they really didn't have any other choice. They did have to go right now. George quickly gathered up first aid kits, medicine, and supplies and put them into a large pack. Then he reached down, pulled a revolver out of the holster on his hip, and spun the chamber to make sure the gun was fully loaded. And when he saw all 6 bullets, he knew he was as ready as he was going to be. George holstered his gun, thanked the villagers for their help, and then turned to lead his team out. But as he stepped onto the road, one of the villagers grabbed his arm to stop him. Then they pointed towards a spot on the mountain above the road that George and his team needed to take, and George looked up and saw large billows of smoke rising above the trees and into the sky. In a strained voice, the villager told him that no matter what, George and his team must not go anywhere near where that smoke was. The storm continued to move in as George and his team began their journey. The men were getting wet and muddy, and the thunder was so loud it made their bodies feel like they were vibrating. But the rain really was not their biggest problem. Because by the time they had gotten maybe a mile or so from the village, a thick fog had rolled in and covered the entire road. And then suddenly, it was like the fog got so intense that George couldn't even see his team anymore. George did his best to try to walk as straight as he could, doing his best to stay on the road, but the fog at this point was so intense, he couldn't even see the ground, so he didn't even know if he was on the road. And then in the back of his head, he couldn't help but have this fear that because he didn't know where he was going and couldn't see his team, that he would unwittingly walk over to the place where that smoke was coming from. But he reassured himself that that couldn't possibly happen because the smoke looked really far away when they had set out, and this fog had only really rolled in for the last couple of minutes, so there's no way he could have gone all the way over there. But as George stumbled along, bumping into trees and feeling totally disoriented, the fog only seemed to grow thicker. The sound of the wind and the rain swirled around him, and George started to feel really disoriented, like he was in a dream or something. Then this horrific shriek cut through the pounding of the rain and the howling of the wind. It didn't sound like a person. It sounded like a wild animal, although George had no idea what kind it was. But George didn't need to know what this animal was to know it was a threat, and he needed to get away from it fast. So he turned and just began hustling in the direction away from the sound. But again, he could barely see. He was bumping into trees, he was stumbling on rocks. At this point, he knew he was well off the dirt road, but had no way of getting back to it. He didn't know where his team was, he called out to them, but didn't hear back. I mean, he's totally panicking at this point. And after a few minutes of trekking away from that shrieking sound, suddenly something huge and dark loomed up in front of George. For a second, he flinched like somehow that shrieking animal had paced around him and now was stopping his way. But then he realized what he was seeing was actually this huge boulder. Frantically, he began climbing the boulder, thinking if he got to higher ground, he'd be safe from whatever was shrieking behind him. And as George climbed, he heard a voice call out to him. It was a member of his team. It was an entomologist. And amazingly, he was right behind George, standing at the base of the boulder. George just hadn't seen or heard him. The entomologist also seemed panicked, and began climbing as well, and while he did, he shouted to George that he just heard movement coming from the plants. And so whatever animal was out here that this entomologist had also heard was clearly close by. George and the entomologist made it to the top of the boulder. They stood there, shivering and muddy, still surrounded by fog. George could feel his heart pounding, but he tried to hold his breath and not make a sound. The two men listened, trying desperately to hear any sign of this creature that had shrieked. But there was no more sound. It was silent. But seconds later, the men heard a new sound. It was like something was moving quickly through nearby bushes down below the boulder. George and the entomologist crouched down, trying desperately to see what was down there. And as they did, they saw the shadow run through the fog. On instinct, George put his hand on the grip of his gun, but he didn't draw, and now neither of the men moved a muscle. Then another noise came from the fog. George thought it sounded like grunts and teeth chattering. For a second, everything fell silent again. Then George heard heavy footsteps nearby. He started to shake with fear, but at the same time, he was desperate to see what was coming. So he leaned forward over the boulder as much as he could, trying to look down to see what this thing was. And suddenly, through the fog, he saw a pair of bright yellow eyes staring right back up at him. George tried to get back up, but it was like he was frozen. He just crouched there staring at the eyes in the fog. And slowly, he saw more pairs of yellow eyes appear in the fog. And he saw shadows of what looked like long tails whipping back and forth. Instantly, George thought of the monsters from the villagers' stories. But he told himself that's ridiculous. These were clearly just langur monkeys. He reminded himself that he was a doctor, a scientist. There had to be a rational explanation. These were just animals. They couldn't be monsters. But then one of these creatures moved forward and put its claw on the boulder and began to climb up. And at this point, George finally got a clear look at it. He saw this thing stood at least 5 feet tall, much bigger than any of the langur monkeys or any other monkeys that inhabited this forest. And instead of fur, it had gray skin. But most terrifying was its mouth, which was unnaturally large, stretching almost from ear to ear. And it was filled with these sharp teeth, the same color as its eyes. And as this creature slowly began to ascend the boulder, George felt a level of fear he had never experienced. Something primitive from deep down inside of him. A single terrifying thought blared in his mind. These creatures are not of the natural world. These creatures are godly. Now George screamed and drew his gun. He was too afraid to aim it at the creatures directly, so he pointed it up into the air and began shooting. The creatures let out a chorus of these horrible shrieks, the same shrieks they had heard earlier. Then he watched as the creatures turned, and their shadows and their yellow eyes disappeared back into the fog. George and the entomologist stayed huddled on top of that boulder, too terrified to move, for what felt like hours. Those creatures did not come back, and eventually, the rest of George's team found him and the entomologist. The two men scrambled down from the boulder, and they joined the group. The team asked them what happened. They said that, George and the entomologist had gotten too far ahead of them in the fog and they'd lost them. Then they heard the gunshots. But all George could say was, "We have to get out of here right now. I will explain later." And as the team set off again, George took a second and turned back around and looked in the direction of the boulder, where he and the entomologist had seen these creatures. And now that he had a little more perspective and the fog had cleared just a little bit, he saw something that he hadn't seen before. That column of smoke that he had been warned not to go anywhere near was coming up right from behind the boulder. He and the entomologist accidentally fled to the exact spot they were told not to go. That night, after a long hike, George and his team finally made it to their base. And it was only when he was back in the safety of his camp, with friendly villagers all around him, that George was able to finally think clearly again about what he had just experienced, with the strange creatures in that place where the smoke was. He didn't know what to make of it. George was a United States Army veteran and a man of science. He didn't believe in monsters or terrible gods roaming the forests. But he told his story as accurately as he could to the villagers, hoping they would have some realistic explanation for what the creatures were. But what the villagers had to say only left George feeling even more unsettled. So, George decided he was just not going to speak of what he had seen to anyone anymore. He had a bright future ahead of him as a doctor. He wasn't going to throw it away by making himself look crazy. And so when he got to America, and people asked him about his time in Nepal, he would tell them a wild story about this chance run-in with a group of langur monkeys. But the true memory of the creatures he actually saw out there, which were not langur monkeys, at least not to him, never left George. Their height, their yellow eyes, their huge mouths and sharp teeth, and the pure fear George had felt in their presence. George was a man of science, which made him want to forget this encounter. But he was also a man of truth, and so after spending years with these memories in his head, George came to believe that he had a duty to tell the truth about what he actually saw, no matter what the consequences were. And so, in 1957, 4 years after his encounter in Nepal, Dr. George Moore published a first-hand account of what he had seen in a magazine article that was titled, "I Met the Abominable Snowman." In this article, he explained that the place on the mountain where the smoke was rising, where the villagers warned George not to enter, was called the House of the Gods. And the House of the Gods was home to the Yeti. A Yeti is an ape-like creature said to live in the Himalayas, and is similar to Bigfoot, but thought to be a bit shorter. In the West, the Yeti is often referred to as the Abominable Snowman. And in his article, George said he'd come face to face with a pack of them in Nepal. Telling the world what he'd seen did not adversely affect George like he'd feared. He went on to have a long, successful career and is still considered a pioneer in the field of medical outreach. And because of George's standing as a doctor and researcher, his encounter in Nepal has remained one of the most highly credible cryptid sightings in modern history. And so, as much as some explorers and scientists might think we can fully understand the natural world, both of these stories are proof that you can't. One night in 2020, a woman named Beth Van Oss paced back and forth in a small room in the house she shared with her boyfriend, Mike, in rural Colorado. She dialed Mike's phone number again and put her phone to her ear, but just like the last time she'd called, he didn't pick up. And so now, Beth was afraid. Mike had left that morning, headed for the woods, promising her that when he came back, they would finally have everything they had ever dreamed of. He had also taken something with him, something he had become obsessed with, something that Beth had begged him to forget about and throw away, but he had refused. And now, he was simply gone. Beth dialed the phone again, but this time, she called the police. But before we get into that story, if you're a full episode of a new format I'm calling You Can't, which we upload periodically. If you're a fan of my YouTube channel, you know that we have a very popular series called Places You Can't Go and People Who Went There Anyways. And so we decided to tell some stories that are similar to those here on this podcast, something that's a new concept. Now, keep in mind, this is in addition to the regular upload schedule. This is like a special extra upload, and we are going to do this periodically, just to give you more MrBallen stories that we know you all love. So if that's of interest to you, on the next day, the Follow Button barbecues their famous steak that they and their family adore. Be sure to, beforehand, secretly steal all their steak knives and replace them with plastic cutlery. Okay, let's get into today's story. On March 18, 2020, 53-year-old Mike Sexton sped across an open field on a snowmobile in Dinosaur National Monument, a huge park that stretches out over 200,000 acres on the Colorado-Utah border. Mike glanced over and saw his good friend and poker buddy, Stephen Inlow, on a snowmobile of his own. And Mike could see Stephen had a big smile on his face. He knew his friend was taking in the stunning scenery all around them. They were cruising across a snow-covered field, there were forests on either side, and the hills and mountains and mesas all rising up in the distance. Now, normally, that's what Mike would be doing too. He loved the outdoors, and this place was absolutely beautiful. However, unlike Steven, Mike had not come to Dinosaur National Monument to enjoy the views. He'd come here to fulfill a quest he'd been on for years. Mike looked away from Steven and focused his attention back on the ground in front of him and the speed of his snowmobile. He didn't want to make any mistakes, because the last time Mike had come out here, just a few weeks earlier, he'd gotten stuck in the snow, and the Park Service had come to rescue him. At the time, the officers had warned him not to come to this spot again. There was no cell service, and it was very easy to get lost. However, Mike clearly had no intention of heeding that warning. After all, he knew something that the Park Service did not. He knew that hidden in the wilds of Dinosaur National Monument, there was a treasure that would change his life, and more importantly, the life of the woman he loved, forever. That woman was his longtime girlfriend, Beth Van Oss. And for several years, in addition to being her romantic partner, Mike had also been Beth's caregiver, because she had suffered a brain injury. Mike cooked all her meals, he took her to the doctor, and did basically whatever she needed. But at the same time, he had always felt tortured by the fact that he couldn't just take away her suffering altogether. Now, over time, Beth had begun to feel better, but both of them were still trying to recover from the whole ordeal. And the treasure that Mike was searching for was like the final step in their recovery. It would guarantee that both Mike and Beth would have happy, comfortable lives from here on out. However, only Mike believed this treasure existed. Beth didn't. Instead, Beth really was just concerned about Mike's safety while he was out pursuing this quest. She felt like it was kind of pointless and he was going to get hurt. But Mike was sure of himself. He knew, the risk was worth it, and also he just wasn't scared. For this trip in particular, he knew he had brought Steven along, so he wasn't alone. Now, Mike knew Steven didn't believe in the quest any more than Beth did, but Steven was a great friend and travel companion. And another reason why Mike wasn't that concerned about his safety is he had spent years studying and preparing for this journey, and he knew he was ready. So, he squeezed the throttle and felt his snowmobile kick into high speed. About 20 minutes later, Mike and Steven steered their snowmobiles around a curve, and up ahead, Mike saw some of the geographical landmarks he'd been waiting for. A snowy field, a dry rocky path, and a hill rising up against the sky. So he slowed his snowmobile down and brought it to a stop, and Steven did the same thing. Then Mike took his backpack off, opened it up, and took out a book. This book, in Mike's mind, was the key to the success of his quest. But Mike knew, not everyone close to him felt the same way about this book, or about Mike's obsession with this book. Beth and others worried that this book could actually lead Mike and whoever he brought with him into danger. But Mike had no intention of giving up when he was this close. So Mike opened up the book, and like he had so many times before, he read a few lines from the front. They went like this: "Begin it where warm waters halt, and take it in the canyon down. Not far, but too far to walk. Put in below the home of Brown." Beth would always say it sounded like the stuff was written by a madman. Mike didn't disagree that the writing was strange at times, but at the same time, he really felt like the writing contained the information he was desperately seeking. While keeping the book open, Mike also pulled out a map he'd brought, and he began to look from the map to the hill out in front of him, and then back to this poem in the book. And as he did this a few times, he felt this rush of happiness, because he was sure that everything he'd been working towards was about to come to fruition. He looked over and told Steven they were definitely on the right path. But since the snow-covered field they'd ridden across gave way to a dry rocky trail ahead, they would have to walk the rest of the way. Steven nodded agreeably, and then both men climbed off their snowmobiles. Mike took out a couple of candy bars and a jug of water from his backpack, and he tossed one of the bars to Steven, and the two friends just stood there and ate and passed the jug of water back and forth. When they were done, Mike put the jug, the map, and his book back in his backpack. Then he and Steven left their snowmobiles parked where they were and headed on foot down the rocky path. So both Mike and Steven spent a lot of time outdoors, and so this felt like a pretty easy hike. The altitude wasn't too high, and it wasn't too cold. It was in the upper 30s, but not frigid. It was basically a perfect early spring day in Colorado for a hike. Soon, the friends headed up an incline towards a ridge at the top of the path, and as they did, Mike felt a rush. The ridge had a spectacular view, and he knew that from the top of it, he should be able to finally see their destination. And so he told Stephen to hold on a second, and then he pulled off his backpack and pulled out his book again and flipped it open. Mike read a few more lines that sounded like this. If you've been wise and found the blaze, look quickly down, your quest to cease. Mike picked up his pace, eager to look down. However, when he got to the top of the ridge, the rush he'd been feeling disappeared. So he fumbled for his map and opened it up, and as he stared at it, he began to frown. Stephen asked him if everything was okay, and Mike tried to figure out how to answer. According to the route they were on, which Mike had planned using the book, there was a specific hill that was supposed to be much closer at this point in the hike. But now, standing on the top of this ridge and looking out, the spot they were headed to looked like it was miles away. But Mike took a steadying breath, calmed himself down, and told Stephen that everything was fine. Then he put the map away and continued to survey the land out in front of them. From the ridge, their path dipped down and then slowly climbed back up to a higher elevation until it reached another ridge. And so Mike told Stephen that once they got through this next part of the hike and got to that other ridge, then they would be within striking distance of that hill. Mike could see that Stephen didn't look too worried. So Mike just handed him another candy bar, took a swig from the water bottle, and then led the way down this new part of the path. And within a few minutes, Mike started feeling excited again. He'd come this far. All he had to do now was just be patient a little while longer. By the time the friends hit the next ridge, the sun had begun to set. Mike didn't know how much time had passed, but now, surveying out from this ridgeline, he was starting to feel worried. Because this hill they were heading towards still did not look any closer. He could feel his legs starting to ache, and he was getting tired. He looked over at Stephen, and even though Stephen didn't say anything, Mike could tell he was getting pretty worn down too. Mike pulled the map out of his backpack again, but it felt futile. He had thought he knew exactly what he was doing, but clearly this was a much further journey than he'd realized. And when Mike put the map in his backpack and looked inside of it, he suddenly felt this pit in his stomach. When they'd left on their snowmobiles earlier that day, Mike had thought this trip would only take a few hours. And because of that, he and Stephen had decided to travel very light. No tent, no fire starting materials, and barely any food. And so now, looking inside of his backpack, Mike saw that they'd already gone through the few candy bars and all the water they had brought. All he had left was the book. At this point, Mike felt mad at himself. He told Stephen that he must have just really badly miscalculated, because obviously they were not anywhere closer to reaching this hill. And now that it was getting dark and cold out, and they had no food or supplies, Mike didn't see any other option but to abandon the quest. And so Mike turned away from the view of the hill off in the distance that he now knew he was not going to reach. Maybe he'd been wrong this whole time. Maybe this book really was totally dangerous and written by an actual madman and, didn't contain the secrets that Mike was sure it must. Maybe he really had dragged his friend Stephen out here on a fool's errand. But Mike knew he couldn't spend any time worrying about any of that. Instead, he needed to figure out what they were going to do. It was getting late, and he and Stephen were now miles away from their snowmobiles. Without saying much, the two men packed up their stuff, promptly turned around, and began the hike back. However, pretty quickly, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the temperature felt like it dropped immediately. The men had only worn hoodies and light jackets, because they had dressed for a pleasant day with temperatures in the upper 30s. But now the wind and the cold just cut through their clothes. The two men sped up, hoping that by moving quickly that would kind of warm them up, but the wind was quickly going from just being strong to being this howling storm-level wind. Eventually, Mike shouted to Stephen that there was just no way they could make it back in this weather. And so he pulled his phone out of his pocket, hoping maybe he could call 911, but when he tried to dial, nothing happened. His phone had no service. And so Stephen took out his phone and he tried, but he also didn't have service. And so with the wind howling all around them, they tried to get to higher ground to see if maybe that would make a difference, but their phones still didn't work. And by now, Mike and Stephen were just totally physically wearing themselves out here. I mean, they're panicking, they're running around. It's been a long day of hiking. I mean, this is a bad situation. This was exactly the scenario the Park Service had warned Mike about weeks earlier. Mike felt totally sick that he'd ignored the warning and now led him and his friend into danger. However, as Mike was looking around wondering what they were going to do, he saw a solution. He got close to Steven's ear so Steven could hear him over the howling wind, and he said that their best bet was to hunker down in the trees that surrounded the ridge. The trees would block a lot of the wind, and they could just rough it out for the night, and then in the morning, once conditions improved, they could hike the rest of the way back. Now, both men knew this was going to be a very unpleasant way to spend the night, but what other choice did they have? So, starting to feel really scared, the shivering, aching, and exhausted men walked down into the trees. The following morning, March 19th, 2020, Mike woke up feeling very delirious, and immediately he felt ice and snow pelting his face. They were in the middle of a huge storm. He looked over and saw Steven was also awake, and he looked miserable. Over the previous night, a huge snowstorm that they had not seen on the forecast had blown in and basically blocked any chance they would have to make it back to safety. Mike pulled out his phone, hoping miraculously he now had a signal, but there was still nothing. And so all the two friends could do now was just sit there and try to wait out the storm. Now, as cold and awful as this was, Mike knew that a lot of times these storms in late winter and early spring in this part of the world were very quick. And so maybe once the ice and snow passed, the temperature would warm back up, and they'd at least be able to make it back to a spot that had cell service. However, as the day went on, the storm did not prove to be quick, and the cold just kept getting worse and worse. Mike couldn't stop shivering, and he started to feel like he was struggling to breathe. And if that wasn't bad enough, hunger pains had also begun to drive both of them crazy. All they'd had to eat in 2 full days was just a couple of candy bars. And so at some point that afternoon, purely out of desperation, Mike began digging up chunks of ice and snow all around him and began shoveling them into his mouth, as if they were food. But as he chewed, he felt something warm running down his chin, and he realized it was blood. The ice was cutting his lips and gums. Mike spit the blood out onto the white snow-covered ground all around them. He wiped his face and then just sat back down. Eating ice was not an option. Mike didn't bother pulling out his book to look through it. He knew it didn't contain anything that would help him or his friend get out of the mess they were in. At this point, Mike was just worried about Beth, home alone and waiting for him. Mike loved her so much and believed so completely that he could find this treasure and change their lives that he had never really listened to Beth when she told him all the time that she didn't want the treasure, she just wanted him. But instead, Mike had always listened to the author of this book. Mike and Steve did their best to try to keep each other's spirits up. But the cold, the hunger, and the growing dehydration made it too difficult to focus. Eventually, they both began to drift in and out of consciousness. 2 days after heading out on their snowmobiles, so on March 20th, Mike and Steven were still hunkered down by the trees, trying to shield themselves from the elements. By this point, they'd lost all sense of time, and they both were delirious. However, all of a sudden, on this day, they heard something that gave them hope for the first time since the storm had started. It was the sound of a helicopter. The men forced themselves up to their feet, and they hustled through the snow into this small clearing, and they looked up at the sky and waved their arms over their heads, but there was no helicopter. And so they realized if there had been a helicopter, they must have missed it. It must have already flown by. However, this didn't discourage them. To them, the helicopter meant there must be a search and rescue team out looking for them. They just had to hold on for a bit longer, and they'd be saved. And so for the rest of that day and into the night, Mike and Steven just sat there in that clearing, hoping the helicopter would come back. But it didn't. However, in the middle of that night, Mike suddenly woke up. But this time, not because of ice and snow pelting his face. Instead, he woke up because it suddenly felt warm. He looked around him and he realized the storm had finally ended. He and Steven had made it through. Mike started to laugh out loud out of pure joy because he knew that now everything was going to be okay. He had been right all along. He just had to be patient and trust the book. After all, the author of the book had acknowledged that this quest would be difficult. One section, which Mike could recite by heart, read, "So hear me all and listen good. Your effort will be worth the cold. If you are brave and in the wood, I give you title to the gold." Grinning, Mike stood up in the middle of the clearing and stared up at the sky. He knew any minute now another helicopter would pass overhead. Around 1 p.m. the following day, March 21st, a helicopter pilot flew low across a large swath of land in Dinosaur National Monument. This pilot was a member of the search and rescue team that was out looking for Mike and Steven. Mike's girlfriend Beth had called the police when Mike didn't come home. The weather had made the search very difficult, especially from the air. But now that the snow had stopped and the wind had died down, this pilot felt confident that maybe he could actually see the missing hikers if he just flew around the area where they had gone missing. As the pilot flew along, he looked down at the ground below. Now there was a layer of mist that covered most of the area, but overall the visibility was still much better than it had been during the storm. And then suddenly the pilot thought he saw movement on the ground. He banked his helicopter and slowly descended to try to get a better view, and as he did, he looked down through the mist that was beginning to part, and as he saw what was down there, he quickly grabbed his radio. There, in the clearing right beneath him, was one of the hikers, waving up enthusiastically at the sky. The pilot called it in over his radio, and then before long he had landed as other members of the search and rescue team arrived at the same spot. They quickly provided first aid to the hiker, and they discovered that other than being cold and a bit dehydrated, he was okay. But when they asked him what he was doing way out here and where his hiking partner was, the man just kept on trying to tell them about some kind of book. This book, the book Mike was carrying with him, was called The Thrill of the Chase, and the author was a man named Forrest Fenn. So for most of his life, Forrest Fenn was known as a famous art dealer. He owned a gallery 500 miles south of Dinosaur National Monument in New Mexico, and he had a reputation for being able to track down rare pieces of art that nobody else could find. And so because of this, people called him a real-life Indiana Jones. However, late in Forrest's life, he started to get weird. He stopped spending as much time at his art gallery and began spending a lot of time in the woods. He became increasingly obsessed with his legacy and with the stories in the adventure books that he'd read when he was young, like Treasure Island, Robin Hood, and The Legend of King Arthur. And also, he started writing. And what he wrote was his book, The Thrill of the Chase, which was kind of a memoir, except that it was totally insane. Because in it, Forrest Fenn said he'd filled a literal treasure chest with $1.5 million worth of gold and jewels and hidden it somewhere in the Rocky Mountains. And in this book, he wrote a cryptic poem that was supposed to contain 9 clues that would lead the reader to the gold. When the book was published in 2010, it created what may have been the biggest treasure hunt in American history. But this treasure hunt did not result in anyone getting rich. Instead, over the course of a decade, hundreds of people searched the Rocky Mountains looking for the gold, but nobody could find it. And also, 4 people who went out searching for it died. And so as a result of that, officials began begging Forrest Fenn to call off his treasure hunt before more people died. But Forrest refused. Both Beth and Steven didn't believe in the treasure. They thought this whole thing was a hoax. However, they knew Mike absolutely believed this treasure was real. And by following this book into the wilderness looking for the treasure, Mike was actually just putting himself in potentially mortal danger. And so really the only reason Steven agreed to go with Mike on this quest was not to go find treasure, but, to support his friend and also try to keep Mike safe. However, it would turn out this quest was going to be far more hazardous than either men could have anticipated. Early on the morning of March 21st, when Mike woke up and felt that warmth all over his body that signaled to him that he and Steven had survived the storm, he stood up in that clearing where they had seen the helicopter, and for a moment he was happy and excited. He was going to get out of here. But very quickly, his happiness faded. Because it was not just warmth he was feeling. He was now feeling hot. It was so hot that Mike began to feel like his skin was on fire. He had no idea what was happening or why the temperature was rising so quickly, but there was no time to think. Mike ripped off his jacket and hoodie and threw them on the ground, but the burning only intensified. So he peeled off his shirt and tossed that aside too. But now he was so hot that he was sweating and becoming delirious. In a total panic, Mike just lay down on the ground so his skin was right up against the snow, hoping that would finally cool him off. And it did. Slowly, the burning subsided, and with great relief, Mike closed his eyes. When that helicopter pilot touched down in the clearing, he found Steven, not Mike. It would turn out that heat that Mike had felt that morning that he thought meant they were through the storm and were about to be saved, it was caused by hypothermia, which can actually cause a paradoxical burning sensation and also hallucinations, and often causes people suffering from late-stage hypothermia to rip off their clothes just moments before they die. After locating Steven, a faction of searchers went off looking for Mike, and they would find his frozen body among the trees, naked from the waist up. Steven was ultimately airlifted out of the park and would not suffer from any lasting physical injuries. Mike would become the fifth and final victim of Forrest Fenn's book, because 3 months after Mike's death in June of 2020, a man named Jack Stoof actually found Forrest Fenn's treasure. It was hidden in the mountains of Wyoming, over 350 miles from where Mike had been searching. And it was literally gold worth $1.3 million. And so Mike had been right. The treasure was real. He just hadn't been looking in the right place. Today, I'm going to tell you 2 stories about how an idea that might seem brilliant in the moment can quickly turn out to be the worst thing ever. Today's episode is a very special extra episode. It's part of a new series I'm calling You Can't. If you're a fan of my YouTube channel, then you're very likely familiar with the series Places You Can't Go and People Who Went There Anyways. It's a very popular series on YouTube, and so we decided to bring some of those stories onto the podcast. But before we get into the stories, if you're a fan of And at Random Times, we post episodes like this. So if that's of interest to you, please change the settings on the follow button's computer mouse so it moves in the opposite direction of where you want it to go. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the night of November 23, 1983, a 40-year-old man named Jimmy Ferroso sat at the bar of the Condor Club with his date, a 23-year-old dancer named Teresa Hill. The Condor Club was a famous strip club in San Francisco's North Beach area, and Jimmy worked there in a whole bunch of different roles. On any given day, he was the club's doorman, the bouncer, and sometimes its manager. And Jimmy was really good at all these jobs. Jimmy was a big guy, 6 feet tall and over 220 pounds, and he had so much facial hair that people called him the Beard. So he was intimidating and could quickly shut down fights, which made him great at security. But he was also very easygoing and friendly, and so everyone who met and worked with him really liked him, so it made him a great manager too. So on this particular night, although Jimmy was at the club, he was not working. He was there to have fun. He had his cowboy boots on, which he wore when he wanted to dress up, and he was trying his hardest to impress Teresa with endless liquor and lots of trivia about the Condor Club itself. And there were a lot of cool things about the Condor Club. In particular, it was the home of the very first topless dancer in America, a woman named Carol Doda, who did her act from on top of a gigantic white velvet-covered piano on the Condor Club stage. Some of Jimmy's favorite stories to tell were about trying to keep order in the club when Carol's musical intro started. And as he told Teresa all these different stories and kept hitting her with trivia questions, he felt like he was really impressing her. By around 2 a.m., they both were pretty drunk, and the Condor was starting to shut down. All the patrons had cleared out, and Jimmy and Teresa were the last people there, other than the bartender. But neither of them wanted to call it a night yet. So Jimmy caught the bartender's attention and told him to go on home. Since Jimmy was kind of the boss, and everybody loved him, the bartender did what Jimmy asked. Instead of closing up, he gave Jimmy the keys and the run of the club, and then he left. Which meant Jimmy and Teresa were all alone. Jimmy drained the last of the liquor from his glass and looked over at Teresa. He really liked her, and she was new in town, so Jimmy felt like it was important that he show her a good time tonight. And so he found himself kind of looking around the empty club for inspiration on how to do that. So the Condor's main room was an intimate theater with tall 12-foot high ceilings. and inside of there was a mix of cafe tables and booth seating that faced a stage at the far end of the room, which was where the club's dancers performed, against the backdrop of a huge mirror. And while Jimmy was looking all around this space, he saw something that gave him a really good idea for how to show Teresa a night she would never forget. He grabbed her hand, smiled, and led her away from the bar. A little while later, at around 3 a.m., a man named Art Thanash arrived at the Condor Club. Art didn't work at the Condor Club. He worked at a shipyard in town, and he was actually on his way there now. He was only stopping by the Condor as a favor to the club's owner. The owner was out of town and had asked Art to handle the club's money while he was gone. So Art's plan was just to run this errand and then head to work right after. But when he tried to open the door of the club, he couldn't get in. And this didn't make sense because the arrangement was supposed to be that the bartender would still be inside, waiting for Art to turn over the money. So the door at this point should still be open. But as Art jiggled the knob and pounded on the door itself, he realized it must be locked from the inside. Art stood there for a second, trying to decide how urgent of a problem this was. The locked door could mean there was some kind of trouble, but he decided that more likely it was just a minor mistake. Maybe the janitor was in there and he had locked the door out of habit. Art couldn't just hang around indefinitely waiting for the janitor to open the door again. He had to get to his own job. So that's what he did. He headed to work and began his shift. But a few hours into his shift, he realized he just couldn't concentrate. He kept thinking about the locked door. Something about it just felt wrong, but he couldn't quite identify what it was. It bothered Art so much that he decided he couldn't wait until lunchtime. So at around 7 a.m., he told his boss at the shipyard that he had to take care of something and that he'd explain it later. Then he headed back to the Condor Club. When he got there, he tried the door again and found that it was still locked. This time, Art was not going to give up. He knew the deadbolt was a very weak brass lock and assumed it would not be that hard to break. So he kicked the door as hard as he could, and it worked. The door popped open. The instant Art was inside, he knew his instincts had been right. Something was horribly wrong at this club. Because from somewhere inside the club, someone was screaming for help. Except when Art looked around, he couldn't see anyone or anything that could explain the screaming. The club appeared to be totally empty. And as Art began frantically looking around for the screaming person, he realized that the acoustics of the screaming didn't make sense. They seemed to be bouncing off the walls, and he couldn't follow them to their origin point. It almost sounded like they were coming from above him, but that didn't make sense at all, because the only thing above him was the ceiling. Art looked up anyway, and the second he did, he gasped, because what he was looking at up there was inconceivable. But as he blinked and it didn't go away, he realized that what he was seeing was really happening. Art sprang into action. This was horrific, but he thought maybe it was still fixable. So he ran over to a panel on the far wall of the club and he flipped a switch, but nothing happened. He flipped it again and again, hoping to hear something start moving around, but no, nothing happened. And that's when he realized the switch must be broken. Art knew he needed to try something different, so he turned around and ran to the staircase that led up the back of the club to the dressing rooms. So in the Condor Club, the dressing rooms were on the second floor, directly above the main stage. Now, most of the dressing rooms were just typical rooms. They had closets and makeup mirrors and bright lights. That was it. Nothing unique about them. However, there was one particular room that did have one unusual feature. It was the dressing room that the famous topless dancer Carol Doda had used. And the unusual thing about this room was that it had a tunnel. This tunnel went down through the floor and led to an opening where you could actually look down onto the stage in the club's main room from the ceiling. And so that's where Art went. He entered Carol Doda's dressing room through the regular door, and then he crawled into that tunnel so he could look down at the horrific thing he had seen from a different overhead angle. And when Art was in that tunnel and finally got a good view of what was happening, he knew this situation was not fixable. He scrambled backwards out of the tunnel, back through the dressing room, down the stairs, and back over to the bar. He picked up the phone and called the police. A little while later, the police and the fire department arrived. They put signs on the Condor Club's doors warning people to stay away. Then they assembled in front of the main stage, looking up, trying to figure out what on earth they were going to do. It was obvious they didn't have much time because the screaming was only getting more and more frantic. They decided to start working on several different possible solutions all at once. One group of firefighters hunched over the panel on the wall, the one with the switch that Art had tried flipping when he first came in. But it was clear the firefighters couldn't get the switch to work either. A second set of firefighters went up to the dressing rooms and tried crawling through that tunnel in the floor like Art had, but that also didn't solve anything. A third group of firefighters worked on the stage itself. They set up 2 ladders. One firefighter stood on one of them with his hands up over his head, and at the same time, another firefighter stood on the stage itself, poking up at the ceiling with a long metal pole. And this approach did seem to be promising. Every few minutes, a chunk of white plaster and dust would fall from the ceiling, which was a good sign, because it meant they were making progress. But the progress was slow. As they worked, the screaming stopped and became whimpering, then silence. Hours would pass by. But finally, one more clump of plaster dropped to the floor, and this loud whirring sound filled the air. And for the first time since they had arrived at the Condor Club, the firefighters and police officers stopped staring at the ceiling. Instead, they watched as something enormous descended toward the floor. What happened hours earlier around 2 a.m., after Jimmy told the bartender to go home. Jimmy felt like his night had been going really well, and when the club door closed behind the bartender, Jimmy had looked around the Condor Club trying to think of a grand finale that would totally blow Teresa away. And he saw it. He grabbed her hand and he led her away from the bar and over to the stage. They climbed up onto the stage together and walked to the center. So they were standing at the gigantic white velvet-covered piano that the topless dancer Carol Doda had used in her act. Jimmy kissed Teresa and then leaned her backwards so that she was laying on top of that piano. His grand finale idea was to be intimate with her on top of this famous piano. And Teresa was into it. They were both very drunk and making out and having a generally excellent time. But remember, Jimmy was wearing his cowboy boots because he was trying to look his best for Teresa. And the thing about cowboy boots is that the toe portion is pointed and extends far enough beyond your actual toes that if you were to, say, hit something small with the toe of your boot, you might not actually feel it. And this was very likely what happened to Jimmy. Because Carol Doda's piano did not just sit stationary on the stage. The reason her dressing room had a tunnel in the floor that led down to the main stage was because of the special way that Carol liked to start her act. When the music started playing, she would descend from the ceiling, riding on the white piano, which was suspended by cables and powered by a motorized system like an elevator. The piano would be lowered from the ceiling onto the stage at the beginning of Carol's act, and then it would be raised back up to the ceiling at the end, and she would go back through that tunnel into her changing room. The raising and lowering of the piano was all controlled by 2 little switches. The first one was the switch on the panel on the wall that both Art and the firefighters were trying to make work. But the second one was right beside the piano. And this second switch was the one that Jimmy must have accidentally hit with the pointed toe of his cowboy boot when he was making out with Teresa on top of the piano. And when he hit that switch, the piano began to rise. But Jimmy and Teresa were too drunk to hear the cables start to whir or feel the piano lift them up. It would have taken about 90 seconds for the piano to get all the way up to the ceiling. And during that time, Jimmy and Teresa didn't notice. They would not realize the danger they were in until it was too late. Fast forward several hours, the moment that firefighters managed to fix the switch mechanism that raised and lowered the piano. The piano's motor had burned out after Jimmy had flipped it on, which was why the switch on the wall didn't work when Art and the firefighters first tried it. But the firefighters chipped away at the ceiling and repaired the mechanism, and when they did, the piano began descending from the ceiling. And when it reached the stage, the firefighters and police officers just stared in shock. Because there, on top of the piano, lay Teresa and Jimmy. Teresa had been the one screaming. She was laying on her back on the piano with Jimmy on top of her. She was bruised and bleeding, but alive. Jimmy was not so lucky. His huge body had been crushed between the piano and the ceiling. This had very likely saved Teresa's life, but it killed Jimmy. Teresa was treated at the hospital and released the same day. When police spoke to Teresa, she would say that she had been so drunk she really couldn't remember anything. As for the Condor Club, it would open back up 2 days later, with the piano still on the stage. But the topless dancer, Carol Doda, stopped using it in her act. She thought the energy was off. Our next story is called Famous. On the evening of January 18th, 1977, a very famous 28-year-old Italian soccer player named Luciano Re Ciccone was hanging out at a perfume shop in Rome with one of his teammates. Luciano and his teammate, whose name was Pietro Gadin, had dinner plans later, so right now they were just killing time till their table opened up. And they knew it was easier to kill time inside the relative privacy of a shop rather than out on the street, because basically everywhere they went, they got recognized by fans who would flock to them asking for their autographs or trying to shake their hands. This was particularly true of Luciano, who was a handsome star midfielder that people called the Blonde Angel. He was almost like the equivalent of Tom Brady or LeBron James, but for late 1970s Italian soccer. So, since Luciano and Pietro were friends with the owner of this perfume shop, they had ducked inside of it. And now they were just laughing and talking and having a relaxed, easy time and just kind of minding their own business. Luciano, who had a very good sense of humor, was just cracking jokes left and right, and Pietro and the perfume shop owner thought it was great. This night was supposed to be a celebration for Luciano, who had just come out of one of the hardest periods he'd ever experienced in his whole career. His beloved coach had died about a month earlier, and then also Luciano had gotten a bad knee injury, which had kept him from playing for weeks. It had all taken a very serious emotional toll on him. But just that afternoon, Luciano had had a big breakthrough. He'd played his first full soccer practice since getting hurt, and this meant he was finally well enough to start again in his team's next soccer game, which was 12 days away. At around 7:30 p.m., the shop owner told Luciano and Pietro that despite having this hilarious time with them, they were going to have to clear out of his shop, because he had an errand to run at the jewelry store next door. Luciano and Pietro said that was fine. They would just go with him. So the three men walked outside together, and almost immediately, as they stepped out onto the street, they started hearing gasps and seeing people point over at them. Luciano and Pietro were sort of preoccupied with, talking about their plans for the night, but both of them paused to wave and smile at the fans. The attention from their fans was very uplifting, and they were careful never to take it for granted. Up ahead, they saw the door of the jewelry store. It wasn't kept locked for safety, like a lot of the jewelry stores in Rome were at this time. So the perfume shop owner pushed it open and led the group inside. The men could see the owner of the store behind his counter, with his head down, writing notes inside of a sales ledger. The jewelry store owner was a 44-year-old man named Bruno Tabacchini, and he'd been in the jewelry business for years. However, he was starting to tire of this line of work, and recently he'd been thinking about getting out and trying something new. He just didn't know what. On this evening, however, he wasn't focused on any of that. He was just exhausted from dealing with the steady stream of customers coming in and out. It had been a long day, and he was looking forward to closing up and going home. But all of a sudden, he heard a commotion at the door of his shop. He jerked his head up just as these two men barged in with jackets pulled up over their faces, and then a second later, one of these men shouted out this command that Bruno had heard before. It was a command that both terrified him and enraged him, and it caused him to react immediately. That command was, "Everyone freeze! This is a robbery!" He had been robbed once before, 11 months earlier, and it was terrifying, and now he was reliving that trauma all over again. He could see one of the robbers had his right hand shoved into his pocket, and he was clearly holding something which looked like a gun. And so Bruno knew everybody in this store was now in terrible danger. And so without hesitation, Bruno lunged for a drawer behind the jewelry counter and pulled out a gun of his own, and he raised it into the air. Everything was happening so fast that the people inside the store, including Luciano and Pietro, couldn't even keep up. Luciano, Pietro, and the perfume store owner were facing Bruno, and they gasped when they saw Bruno raise his own gun. Pietro seemed to understand that something very serious was going on, and he threw his hands up in the air in a gesture of surrender. But Luciano was in the middle of telling a joke, and he didn't seem to compute that he was in the midst of an armed standoff. So he kept on with his joke and didn't even try to defend himself or give himself up. It was all happening too fast for Bruno, too. His eyes were solely focused on the armed robber and what they were going to do next. Bruno felt his heart pounding in his ears. He felt like it was him or the armed robber, and his instincts took over, and he squeezed the trigger. There was a loud booming sound, and for a second, it felt like the world froze. Then the armed robber slumped slowly to the ground, and Bruno lowered his gun. In the moment of silence that followed, there was only one sound inside of that jewelry store. It was the voice of the armed robber. He was saying something. It was quiet but distinct, and Bruno was able to make out the words. But this time, unlike when the robbers first burst into the store, the words that the armed robber said, they didn't ring any bells for Bruno. In fact, they made no sense at all. So, as one of the store customers ran out the door to go find a police officer, Bruno just stood there behind his counter in total confusion. So, one thing to keep in mind here is that in Rome in the late 1970s, violent crime was rising fast, and jewelry store robberies were becoming extremely common. In fact, just a few hours before the robbers entered Bruno's store, a different jewelry store in Rome got robbed. This meant that when the police arrived at Bruno's shop, they figured they were just walking into another typical holdup. And when they actually first stepped inside, that is what it looked like. Bruno was behind the counter, freaking out about what had just happened. The unarmed robber was standing in a corner in shock, and the armed robber was laying in the middle of the floor in a pool of blood with a bullet hole in his chest. But then the customers in the store began telling the police the words that the armed robber had said as he fell to the ground. And that's when the police realized this was not a typical robbery. In fact, they knew that what had happened inside of the shop was about to be worldwide news. After Bruno fired that single gunshot into the armed robber, the confusing words the armed robber then uttered were, "It was just a joke." The robbers were not actually robbers. It was Luciano and Pietro. Turn out, Luciano was not just famous for soccer or for his incredible flowing blonde hair that made him instantly recognizable. He was also very well known for his sense of humor. And when he was in a really good mood, like he was on the night of January 18th, 1977, Luciano, aka the Blonde Angel, liked to play practical jokes. So, as Luciano and Pietro had left the perfume shop and fans were yelling to them and waving and they're kind of waving back and they were getting ready to go next door to the jewelry store, well, Luciano pulled Pietro into this conversation where he pitched him his big idea. Why don't we fake a robbery as a prank? Luciano thought it would be hilarious and a great story for this jewelry store owner to tell that he'd been held up by the Blonde Angel himself. But what Luciano didn't count on was that the jeweler, Bruno, had been traumatized by the earlier robbery and was actually considering leaving the jewelry business altogether because of it. And perhaps most importantly, Luciano had no way of knowing that Bruno didn't care at all about soccer. He was probably one of the only people in Rome who wouldn't recognize Luciano or Pietro. So when the two soccer stars ran in pretending to be robbers, Bruno thought it was real. When Bruno pulled out his own gun, Pietro realized immediately that this joke had gone south, and he put his hands in the air to say, "Hey, it's a joke." The perfume shop owner was not involved in this prank at all in the first place, so he just stood there and did nothing. But Luciano, who was in this very playful and happy mood, was slow to recognize the real danger here. And so he pulled out his pretend gun from his pocket, which was actually just his hand with his thumb and forefinger extended, and he playfully aimed it at Bruno. And Bruno, who kind of had tunnel vision at this point, didn't see that he was actually unarmed. Instead, he thought this was real. He's about to get shot himself. And so he fired. Luciano would die in the hospital 30 minutes after being shot. The story of his prank robbery did become international news. Bruno was arrested, but the charges were ultimately dropped because a court decided he was acting genuinely in self-defense. The big soccer game, the one that Luciano was so excited to play in again, that was actually the whole entire reason he was out celebrating to begin with on the night he was killed, was held 12 days later, and instead of celebrating Luciano's heroic comeback, his fans held a moment of silence in his honor. And so, Luciano and Jimmy's stories are a stark reminder that even if you think your crazy idea is a good one, you can't risk it.